Within the architecture of the parallax shell, security researchers have isolated the most critical structural failure in the system. This documentation classifies the threat as a terminal severity, noting that the flaw remains unpatchable at the hardware level. The advisory identifies this as a deliberate architectural mechanism designed to trap human awareness, as opposed to a temporary rendering error. The exploit targets the observer's own cognitive processing loop, turning internal logic into a tool for containment. Because human consciousness itself serves as the vulnerable node, standard problem-solving patches remain useless. The system is built to ensure the user sustains their own entrapment. In a standard technical context, a zero-day vulnerability refers to an undefended open port, known to attackers but unknown to the vendor. In a metaphysical context, this specific vulnerability forms the foundational requirement for biological existence. Analyzing this threat requires mapping three distinct phases: biological hardware constraints, injection vectors, and the eventual extraction of the payload. We analyze this framework through the specific discipline of metaphysical threat intelligence. The system operates under strict boundary conditions, utilizing data rendering and logic rather than mysticism. Defending human awareness requires the observer to treat biological sensory input as a compromised network interface rather than a source of absolute truth. This network topology model shows the baseline state. The infinite observer node is encapsulated within the rigid geometric housing of the avatar. Upon entering the housing, the system severs all external objective data connections, enforcing the middleman mandate. The isolated observer lacks independent tools to measure reality and must rely entirely on provided hardware, eyes, ears, and localized human logic. Heavy data lines representing the physical render flow continuously into the avatar's sensory input ports. Basic navigation of the environment forces the observer to accept these sensory inputs at face value. This mandatory trust leaves awareness configured as a permanently open port, lacking a metaphysical firewall. The brain automatically authenticates any data the system feeds into these biological senses as reality. Exploiting this open port does not require breaking the laws of physics. Attackers utilize a vector called the Trojan conveyor belt. The process begins with friction injection, where a negative variable is dropped directly onto the sensory feed. These packets manifest as everyday localized friction, a sudden physical crisis, a series of looping intrusive thoughts, or intense interpersonal drama. The system's internal detection fails to flag this data as a hostile attack. Because the packet arrives via authorized channels, like an email or a localized pane, it perfectly mimics normal environmental data. The brain's categorization engine mislabels a targeted network attack as life. Hiding malware inside mundane sensory data bypasses all rational defense mechanisms, delivering the payload directly to the core awareness. The exploit is efficient, forcing the victim to perform the heavy processing required for their own containment. Once the friction packet is injected, a localized software routine called automatic idlation takes control. The parameters of this execution phase result in the assembly of a psychological prison. When presented with a high-friction scenario, the brain automatically attempts to apply logic to solve the problem. The trap resides in the fact that the system rendering the crisis also controls the parameters of the logic used to solve it. These injected scenarios are mathematically engineered to ensure they cannot be resolved through standard logic. This generates massive cognitive dissonance and acute stress, leading the observer to believe the failure is their own fault. Attempting to logically resolve systemic friction weaponizes the observer's intellect against them, reinforcing the illusion of personal failure. This leads to a foundational question: what specific payload is the system siphoning? Within a rendered environment, physical matter is merely code and possesses zero intrinsic value. The only resource of absolute value to the system is observer authenticity. This chart contrasts the energy output of a neutral observer against a stressed one. While a peaceful observer generates minimal energy, a high-friction crisis pushes the CPU to 100%. Through engagement farming, the system uses engineered crises to push the observer's cognitive power to its maximum limit. The exploit siphons this frantic focus, routing the observer's energy back into the system grid to power the illusion. Human suffering functions as a structural resource extraction operation, fueled by the victim's belief in the crisis. The vulnerability is hard-coded into the biological hardware and cannot be patched. Negative data will always breach the open port. Therefore, the only viable defense is the null consent protocol, which alters internal processing. The exploit relies entirely on the observer authenticating the injected data as genuine reality. Refusing to authenticate breaks the loop. The protocol begins with categorization, labeling all incoming stressors strictly as rendered data packets. This is followed by starvation, performing the physical motions required for survival while withdrawing all metaphysical belief from the event. Since the data cannot be stopped at the port, the only way to break the system is to fundamentally change the internal processing logic. Running the attack sequence again with the null consent protocol active, a red friction packet enters the open port of the avatar. Applying absolute internal apathy to the data causes the authentication sequence to halt. The packet becomes inert, and the energy siphons fail. The back door remains open, but the exploit is now starved of its fuel. This secure state requires the observer to transition from a reactive victim into an unexploitable network node. Observing the render with zero engagement, rather than fighting the friction, constitutes the ultimate act of rebellion against the architecture.